Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Charlotte Howell, Associate Professor and Director of the Film and Television Studies program at Boston University's College of Communication. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to today's discussion, True Crime Stories. Today's event is special in that it's presented as both the latest episode of The Conversation, a podcast produced by Boston University's College of Communication, and as part of our series of virtual events that we call COMtalks. These feature topics and experts in advertising, film, journalism, media science, public relations, and television. Our conversation today will be recorded and available to watch later online on COM's YouTube channel, as well as on the Conversation podcast feed. The murder case of Adnan Syed, explored in popular podcast serial, Karen Reed accused of hitting her boyfriend with her SUV and leaving him to die, and dozens of other true crime stories captivate the public, inspire books and movies, and attract wall-to-wall news coverage. But why is it that we are so fascinated by true crime? What elements of a crime elevate it to pop culture status or catch our attention? What does it say about us as media consumers, citizens, or simply human beings? These questions and more will be explored in a lively discussion with a researcher grappling with these questions and two journalists with deep experience reporting true crime stories. Now let me introduce them. Katie Caduto is an assistant professor of media science at Boston University's College of Communication. She is the author of the recent study, Compulsive Use of Social Media in Emerging Crime News Stories, published in the Journal of Psychology of Popular Media. Katie, you want to say hi? Great. Dick Lehr is a professor of journalism here at Boston University's College of Communication. He is the author of White Hot Hate, a true story of domestic terrorism in America's Heartland, and Black Mass, Whitey, Bulger, the FBI, and a Devil's Deal, the basis for the movie Black Mass starring Johnny Depp and Benedict Cumberbatch. He is also the host of the ABC podcast Truth and Lies. Welcome, Dick.
Yeah, hi, Charlotte.
And Kate Winkler-Dawson is a professor of practice at the Moody College of Communication at the University of Texas at Austin, and an alum of BU's College of Communication. Kate is the creator and host of the podcasts Wicked World and Buried Bones, as well as the author of Death in the Air, American Sherlock, All That Is Wicked, and most recently, The Sinners All Below. Welcome, Kate.
Hi.
And welcome all of y'all in the webinar. Before we dive in, a word about our format. I plan to get the ball rolling with some questions to each of our individual panelists, and then we'll have some more general questions to the panel as a whole. But by the end of in the last 10 or 15 minutes, some members of our online audience will be able to pose their own questions for the panel. You can submit the questions at any time during our time together via the Q&A tab in Zoom, and we'll get to as many as we can. All right, so starting off, I actually want to ask of all of you, maybe your opinion, is true crime a media genre of its own as well as a subject of media stories? How do we define true crime in that way? What are some of the most notable examples in books, film, television, and audio to get us going? Katie, you want to start us off? You look ready.
Sure. So I think this is a really interesting question and something that came up a lot in doing research around this rather than actually, reporting on true crimes. And so something that I noticed in reading a lot of the literature was that true crime, I love this question of, is it a genre or a subject? Because it is a little bit of both. And that's because true crime anymore has a narrative structure where there are certain audience expectations. You have an idea that you're probably going to learn about a specific victim, a specific perpetrator. And even something like an unsolved crime still has a narrative format where we've developed expectations. And that was really interesting to look at while doing research on this, especially in situations where stories were still developing, because I thought that was an interesting element too. So it's not only a media genre or a subject, but then it's also a news subject, right? A news genre where there are all these really interesting audience expectations. And I think some of the ones you listed at the beginning are really good examples of this. Serial kind of crystallizes that narrative structure, and it made it so easy to get involved in that story where you're waiting for the next piece, you're waiting for the next update. And so I thought, I don't know, I think this is a really great question and a great starting point when we think about, why do we care about this? Why do we get so invested in it?
Yeah, absolutely. And Kate and Dick, you have experience reporting on these stories, crafting them from a kind of journalistic perspective. How do you kind of consider the question of how do we categorize true crime? And
I,
does it
you
matter, I
know,
guess?
well, yeah, I mean, I think Katie's right. It can be both. Certainly, one thing that I thought was interesting about one of your other questions also was, the what are sort of the touchstones in true crime that I think play into what Katie's talking about, the narrative storytelling. And I think a lot of people think about In Cold Blood, the Truman Capote book, which had not only presented this incredible new type of storytelling where you're bringing real stories in, like the true novel, he sort of called it. You're bringing all of these stories in that are real people, real characters, have a real narrative arc. But then the responsibility that comes with true crime, I think, is perfectly illustrated in Capote's book, which is that he framed people incorrectly much of the time. I mean, there were flat out lies. This is something we grapple with throughout this genre. So, there are other, to me, compelling genres. You've got, like sports, that you could tell a really great story through sports. And there are ethical issues there, but our ethical issues and our storytelling revolve around real people experiencing what's most likely the worst thing that they've ever experienced in their life. And so there's a lot of responsibility with that kind of a narrative.
Yeah, and later on, we're definitely going to dig into those ethical considerations.
And
Dick, do you have any?
Well, I was going to also add on because In Cold Blood jumped to mind when you were asking or mentioning books, and it's a complicated book at this point looking back, but uh, I know, and many writers I know really appreciate the significance and impact it had when it came out as almost revolutionary in terms of storytelling about crimes, true crimes, um, going beyond a journalistic sense and adopting the tools of a novelist, which Capote was. And again, becomes complicated and deeply flawed when it emerges much later that he did make stuff up. Uh, but in its moment, in its time, it told a whole generation of journalists and nonfiction writers that there's another way to go deep on these stories and to tell them and to, again, use those devices of novelists with a story arc, character development, dialogue, um, and have a much bigger impact in covering true crime. And I think it was responsible, that book, for a sea change in nonfiction, writing, journalism regarding crimes and the potential uh, ways to tell those stories.
Yeah. So, In Cold Blood is the kind of key turning point
Yep.
for this. But there's
Mhm.
this longer history of true crime from Victorian penny dreadful novels to the rise of like court TV on cable television. And it lately seems that true crime is particularly ubiquitous and particularly prevalent. Do you believe that's true? And if so, any ideas as to why? And feel free to jump in.
Technology, right? Is a big piece of it. I mean, any direction you turn, whether it's, audio podcast, I mean, you can always find true crime now everywhere in a way that you couldn't in, before some of these advances, these formats.
I would
Mhm.
say it's that technology element and the fact that you can be so immersed in it, because so much of this comes from that human interest. And it's a mix of, I hope this never happens to me, but these are real people and there's this like kind of scary relatability. And something I think is really interesting is, social media really makes it easy to jump into any story and not just read about it, but then so many people also feel like they can contribute, right? They're learning and saying like, oh, well, I saw this other case where the police didn't do something. And so now I know what to look for. And so I think you're right that it's technology and then this level too of like learning from the media examples that we have.
Mm-hmm. And I think an even deeper question is, why is the majority of the audience women, which it certainly is. I mean, with my podcast, I think it's 77% female. And so it's interesting. I get the question all the time, why is it mostly women that feel like this is something, when predominantly what we report on are women being murdered, and where that kind of comes from. And I think it's just what Katie was saying, is the empathy that comes from it, this particular kind of storytelling. And, there's that idea of kind of a Sherlock Holmes unlocking a puzzle. That's what really good storytelling is, I think, in the true crime genre, where it starts as a mystery and kind of goes through, and you have a lot of social elements that are important. So I think people come to true crime oftentimes to learn about the killer, learn about maybe the victim, and then they come away knowing a lot more, hopefully, about the victim than they thought, but also about the social issues surrounding that story. And so I think particularly the audience has grown to want to know more about why this situation happened to begin with.
Hey,
Yeah.
Kate, I just noticed on your 70/30, um, that's our panel.
Yep.
That
By
is
design.
very true. But picking up that thread of technology, I want to ask a few questions of Katie, who's done some research, and you just had a published study in the Journal of Psychology of Popular Media that examines true crime stories and social media. How do people follow true crime stories and news via social media? Are there any principal findings from that study that you want to share with us to better understand?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that study was so interesting to do. I have said before, I think it's one of my favorites I've gotten to do because I got a really good sample of honest people. And so one of the things I did want to understand was just first of all, why do people follow this and what are they looking for? And my respondents overwhelmingly said, first of all, that if they're following one true crime story, they're following multiple. And I thought that was really interesting that there is that sense of immersion, and it's not just in one story, but in really wanting to understand this like really large landscape of stories and seeing, what's different from one to the other. But I did also see that people really got invested in stories that they felt had a local connection to them. So maybe if there was a story that was near where they were from or was taking place in the city where they lived. And so that was interesting because I had quite a few people reference specific cases that were national cases, but they had maybe lived by them. And so they felt like they knew the area well. And I thought that was really interesting to see as well, that that sense of I know the area. And that ties into the ability then to feel like I can solve the case or I can help with the case. And so I think that lends itself to further investment. Now, the other element of this, of course, is that a lot of people they use so many different channels. They're, investigating across Reddit and Twitter and TikTok. And so that also makes it easy where they're not just limited to one option. And so again, just this whole ecosystem allows for this really deep immersion, this feeling of like I'm contributing, I'm not just kind of being a voyeur. And I think that ties into some of the ethical issues. I think the audience is becoming more and more aware of those.
Yeah, absolutely. And with social media, just what you said kind of interested me. Do you find any kind of acknowledgement of, social media is there and this kind of content is partially there to monetize the platform, right? Is there awareness of how that kind of fits into people's engagement with these stories on social media?
Definitely. And I would say one of the things I asked people about was not just the fact that you're helping TikTok continue to keep you scrolling, learning your algorithm, but I was also curious about how people interacted with the digital traces left by both victims and perpetrators, because that was
Mm.
something that became really interesting to me when Gabby Petito went missing. I was fascinated by the people who were going to her account, who were going to her boyfriend's account trying to tell him, like reveal yourself or like tell us where you are. And so I asked people, not just how do you feel using these tools, but are you actually going to these accounts yourself? And quite a few people were. And I was really surprised at the honesty in that. But for them, they were saying, if I'm going to be doing this, well, then at least I can offer the family my support. They can have a tangible piece of evidence that someone else cares about this story. On the other hand, with perpetrators, there was this feeling of like, I can help hold this person accountable. I'm taking an active role in making sure they know they did something bad. And I thought that was really interesting. So again, like trying to wrap their minds around, maybe Instagram isn't great, maybe TikTok's not great, but also maybe I can make it a little better. But there is still that element of, are you really, right? Because for a lot of families, they would rather not have those digital traces kind of dug into. And so it was interesting looking at how many people tried to grapple with this balance of, I want to be supportive, but I also feel like I'm being invasive.
Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems like there's that fine line between where does empathy turn into like a parasocial relationship, right? And I know that, you can maybe you want to talk about that with this study, but I know you've also researched dating apps and AI and how people relate to those technologies. So I'm wondering if you see any kind of connections or parallels with true crime, social media engagement,
Oh,
or thinking about it.
absolutely. Absolutely. So I will say in this study, one of the things I measured were parasocial relationships, and I assessed whether people developed them with both victims and perpetrators in the stories that they were following. And what was really, really interesting was the people who said, yes, I'm developing this parasocial relationship, they were much more likely to then continue posting about a crime. And so I think that's really interesting that people, first of all, are following enough that they feel connected to both the victim and the perpetrator. I was really surprised how strong that perpetrator relationship turned out to be. So people are learning about all these characters. Like we said, it's part of this narrative format. So they're getting to know them, and then they're so invested that they're the ones really kind of creating more of the content. And I think that says a lot about then the quality of information that you might be seeing on social media about these cases. And then, like you said, I've also, done lots of relational research looking at how people use dating apps and AI. And I absolutely think there are parallels. I think we probably can't underestimate how much COVID really helps in the acceleration of true crime, where you're at home, your life is online. And that's what I saw with dating apps with AI. And so, yeah, you have even more time to focus on these stories to kind of get to know these characters. And I think technology plays into all of this, where it's become that much more embedded. And so you can follow anything, right? You can get on a dating app and you can message anyone, anywhere, at any time. And in the same way, you can jump on Twitter, see the latest updates about a true crime story, and then you can also keep posting about it. And so I absolutely think there are parallels. And it's just like we said, this evolution of technology, you're not just reading a book and maybe talking to like a book club about it. You can go to a specific forum and say, here are the clues that I have now found. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, affirming, yes. And that gets at kind of where you started, which is that people really tend to flock towards all sorts of stories in this genre and really kind of like make that one of the key areas that they are engaging with media across many different
Yeah.
modes, right? Thank you, Katie. And thinking about, we've brought up narratives, thinking about these victims and perpetrators also sometimes in the way that they get framed or interacted with in these parasocial kind of almost as characters. I want to turn to Dick and kind of ask about your experience of writing these kind of long form books about true crime stories and the weight and the heavy task that that can sometimes be. And so, what are some of the elements of a story, of the narrative, of the victims and the perpetrators that really make you want to devote the time and effort to writing a book about it that takes, years of research, reporting, and writing? And what are some of the challenges that you find in writing these true crime books?
Yeah, well, good question. Thanks. Well, I'm basically in Boston, and there's plenty of crimes to choose from, potentially to write about. Um, but the ones I've written about, and then either first for the Boston Globe, where I was, a reporter for many years, or books. They're stories that have a crime at their core, right? I mean, it's hard to resist those stories. I mean, there's a built-in action that drives the story forward, and as a nonfiction writer, that's a terrific centerpiece to have and to work from. But I've always found, and maybe I think this is the journalistic aspect or the journalist in me, is that I'm most drawn to stories that, while driven forward by a true crime, an investigation, perhaps a whodunit, um, it speaks to something larger and topical. Something could be, issue that might be reverberating in that moment. And I'm thinking of, well, a book I wrote called The Fence, and it's about one of the worst cases of police brutality in Boston Police Department history. And when the victim turned out to be another cop who was in plain clothes, and he was mistaken for a murder suspect following a police chase that ended at a dead end in Boston and surrounded by a fence. The suspects jump out. This cop in plain clothes jumps out, chasing one of the suspects. He climbs on the fence and he's hit from behind. It's Rodney King time. He's beaten until he's unconscious. And someone recognizes that he's a police officer. Um, and he's unconscious there. And instead of helping him, they disappear. It's in midwinter. The official explanation for his uh, uh, being brutalized is that he slipped on ice. So that this in crazy case of police brutality following a murder. And by the way, the victim, I can't help but add that he's today's Boston Police Commissioner, Michael Cox. Talk about a story that runs full circle. But anyway, it became a vehicle to examine the blue wall of silence and the power of that institutional, that culture of cover-up that permeates so many police departments. When you have a victim who's one of your own, and you still can't come forward, and people can't, stand either step forward and take responsibility, or others who know who did it. So it's that kind of thing that I'm looking for. You mentioned Black Mass, which is about the gangster Whitey Bulger and the Boston FBI. It's interesting looking back when we first, that book came out in the late 90s. The original title was Black Mass, the Irish Mob, the FBI, and the Devil's Deal. I mean, it wasn't about Whitey. Again, journalistically speaking, this was a crazy story of FBI corruption in which they protected an informant who happened to be Whitey Bulger. But our focus initially was on the FBI, this public institution, the nation's premier law enforcement agency, and how things could go horribly wrong. Well, over the years, Whitey's kind of profile, has gone national. He was when he was captured and whatnot, and so he now has part of the marquee, display in the title. But again, it goes back to that. It wasn't just another Boston crime story. It wasn't about even a corrupt informant relationship. It was about the FBI and how things can go horribly wrong. So those are the things that appeal to me in a true crime that speak to these other issues.
Yes, thank you. I wonder if you might talk, you have so much experience of telling these stories in different genres, right? Newspaper reporting, books, and you've been hosting a podcast for ABC based on some of the books you've been written. And I was just wondering what you've learned or what you think about some of the differences or similarities of telling these kinds of stories across these different media that have different expectations. And I'm thinking especially of and we might get to this later, but in sound studies and podcast studies, there's a lot of discussion about how audio media can be really intimate because you're listening to it. It's part of your everyday lives, but it's often in headphones or kind of pulls you in sonically, right? So I would love to get your kind of experience or thoughts on that kind of how do these stories change as they move across media?
Yeah, no, some of the lessons I've learned moving from the newspaper story to the book or a long form narrative. And, looping back to some of the comments made earlier, in books, in writing the narrative nonfiction books, you need an amazing amount of resource material. And combined with realizing that you can use some of these tools of a novelist to create this narrative that hopefully, because of these storytelling devices, are far more intimate from a reading experience than, say, reading a newspaper. So there was that lesson learned, and how yeah, and there's a scene in Cold Blood, for example, that where Capote reconstructs the farmer Clutter's last day before he's brutally slain, and it writes about how he's in his bathroom shaving and whatnot, and he just pulls the reader in because there's such intimate detail about the pink tiles and stuff. I mean, so he's really bringing you in, and it's an eye for those kinds of details which you'd have no room for in a newspaper story. So there was that first big step from newspapers into books and long form narratives, but more recently with podcasts, which I think are great. There's this, and you used the word, I think a new an expanding sense of intimacy that the podcast, it's, I think, the audio piece of it, but also one thing I've learned in the podcast is, how you bring the listener in with you, like in a participating kind of way, like I'm knocking on the door here, and that kind of sound and that kind of audio. It's not just a straight storytelling. Often the host or whatever is walking the story, is doing the story and telling you, and you're with that person as they arrive someplace. They don't know what's going to happen next when they try to interview somebody. That has a real intimate and real time sensibility to that. And I have to say that in the book I'm just finishing now, I feel like I've adopted or adapted some of those I call it kind of podcasty, in terms of storytelling that isn't necessarily linear, storytelling that where I'm in it a little bit in a way that I've never done before in my earlier books. Doing that kind of podcasting, sitting down with someone and setting up a scene that way. I mean, it has, and again, I don't think I would have done that had I not had the experience of, working on podcasts.
Yeah, thank you. Kate, I know you've had some similar experiences of telling stories across many different forms of media. I wonder if you could jump in and talk about how you've seen some of that changes or evolution, or what stays the same.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Dick is spot on about that. That podcasting is a very intimate platform, much more than, for me, books. I had, like Dick, I had sort of the experience of doing a straight true crime book that's narrative, though, in form, that feels like a kind of a Capote type of book. And I certainly shied away from inserting myself into it because, as a journalist, it's just not something I've ever been comfortable doing. And, to a point where my first book, which involved a serial killer in London in 1952, I wasn't comfortable even coming to a conclusion about whether he murdered his neighbor's wife and child, because I'm a journalist and my editor said, you have to make a decision. As I started shifting into podcasting, my first podcast was called Tenfold More Wicked, which is what Dick's talking about. It's immersive. It's one either series of crimes or it's one story told through 6 episodes that are about 40 minutes. So it's a true crime documentary podcast where I go to Scotland to report on Burke and Hare. And, these are all historical crimes. And so when I first started, I think it was my first episode of my first season, I was going to start with this very long sort of a intro, and this is who I am and all of this. And I listened to it, and it was me in a studio. And I said, this is not the right thing to do. And so instead I started with, audio of me climbing a very steep hill of a cemetery in the snow with a relative. And we end up at a massive grave site with all of these murder victims from this one family that one person is responsible for. And that was just a lot more. I mean, that's when I really realized that I need to pull myself into it. And then as I've sort of progressed along with podcasting, that spilled over into other podcasts. I'm actually literally getting ready to tape in 31 minutes a podcast with a forensic investigator named Paul Holes, and we have a show called Buried Bones, in which we have to talk about ourselves. That's what the audience expects. So there's 5 to 10 minutes worth of, he chats about his fish, I chat about my dogs or my kids, or we talk about experiences that we've had that are not death and destruction, because the podcast audience, you're in their head. I mean, I just came back from a pretty massive event where people were saying, I go to sleep with your voice at night, I cook, I go on my walks, my husband and I sit around like it's the old ABC radio stories and listen to it. So it's very different. And then that spilled into the book that I just had mentioned that just came out in January, which is called The Sinners All Bow, which is about the very first true crime narrative that was written in 1832 by a woman who covered a case. I would call it a true novel very much, where she covered this case of this woman who was murdered by her Methodist minister. And, the woman who was a poet was hired to write a narrative book about it. And I joined her and we examined the case together, even though she died, years later. But it was the same ethical issues that Capote had. She was conflating facts. She was doing all sorts of things from more than 100 years ago. So we've all kind of had these same experiences. And no matter what our genre is, there's so much responsibility that we have. And that's sort of what, the intimacy part of it, I have even more responsibility in some ways with podcasting.
Yeah, thank you. And thinking about that, kind of like, where are those boundaries of the genre? Where are the new innovations? I want to come back to Dick. Your latest book, White Hot Heat, tells the story of white nationalists plotting against an immigrant community. Some may consider that a true crime story, but it also feels different than, say, a book about a serial killer, right? How do you think about the genre of true crime and what stories you feel fit into it, or shift maybe our ideas of the genre? And of course, you can see that thread from what you said of, you want to get at something that's a topical, broader issue through this story of what is a crime.
Yeah, no, I mean, again, kind of what I sasaid earlier, and what you're just saying again. This was a story about a bunch of white nationalists and a breakaway militia called the Crusaders, who were conspiring to build homemade bombs, fertilizer bombs, to kill the Somali immigrant community that had moved into Garden City, Kansas, southwest Kansas, and many of whom were working in the Tyson meatpacking plants and whatnot. Um, yeah, so for me, is first of all, it was a story that highlights the spike in far right extremism and white nationalism that we've been experiencing the last decade. The bigotry aimed at Muslim refugees that's been part of our culture again in the last decade. One thing I liked about this true crime story, while it was obviously involved a criminal conspiracy to build homemade explosives and kill people, it was one of the few, maybe the only story I've written about where the crime did not succeed. So it was a foiled effort of terrorism, and that appealed to me in a big way because this was it's a story that's full of such darkness, but it ends on a note of hopefulness in a community that came together, that bent and didn't break. And the other aspect, and I referred to this earlier about, having the sort of raw material to push what might have been a front page newspaper story for many weeks or whatever into something that's book length. And a lot of the terrorism plots and the rest that you have read about, most of them have pled out before trial. So there might be coverage, during around the crime and the arrest, and there might even be, obviously coverage as it's in the courts, but then it just stops. Um, and so this was an opportunity because it did go to trial, and you had access to all these secret recordings that, the FBI had an informant in the militia. Um, in a way that I don't think had been really part of the other, many of the other front page stories that, so it felt like a way to uniquely capture this big issue that's part of our lives today, to have those kinds of research. A story that to me was timely and remains troubling in terms of the militia movement around this country.
Yeah, I think that's a really important way to think about maybe the expansiveness of this genre as well. And turning to Kate, right? We've sprinkled in some discussion about the ethics and the ethical questions and dilemmas around true crime. But I want to turn to you and kind of, because I know that you really think about these things. What are some of the main ethical dilemmas true crime content creators face? Right? We've seen a lot of stories about re-traumatizing victims, glorifying killers. You've brought up some journalistic ethics of like, how do you present the facts without bias? So I was just wondering if you could give us all kind of ethical 101 for true crime.
Sure. So probably about a year ago, I was approached by the head of the National Center for Victims of Crime to work with them on thinking through ethics. And so they've come up with these great brochures, which I can send to you all. Maybe you'll be able to post that they've come up with, which are, kind of a guideline for not only content creators, but also for people who consume true crime on the ethical ways to do it. And I think there are some things, that I've experienced. I teach a true crime podcast course at the University of Texas, and most of this is based on, I tell them at the beginning, I want to listen to podcasts that are both good and have some problems. And by the end of this, I want you to be able to pick ethical podcasts for you to listen to. And so there is the stuff that you're talking about, which is re-traumatizing victims and survivors and their families. There is certainly not addressing what I usually say is using the victims as props in your story, as minor characters, and homing in on instead the serial killers particularly. And then you see threads on Reddit of true crime threads where you'll see, but on Reddit and other places too, where there are people not only just glorifying the serial killers, but also emulating them, wanting to emulate them. So can be incredibly disturbing. I'm sure Katie's run across that too in her research. And then, there is, of course, approaching the families without permission, which happened an awful lot, not only in Gabby Petito's case, but also with the Idaho case, the Idaho 4 case, the 4 young people who were murdered. And I think you see that mostly in the recent cases. And quite frankly, I call those the clear and present danger cases. Brian Kohlberger's out. Where is he? We want to find him. We can help more than the police. And oftentimes it is the police are idiots and they don't know anything about technology and we're smarter than they are. And so, then you've got, people with the blame game that I think goes across social media, not only just with the crime sleuths, but people who are speculating and over speculating. Asked, how do we stop that? The easiest thing is unsubscribe for the people from TikTok or Instagram or whoever, who are either lying or ignoring facts, making things worse, particularly with active cases like that. And and then I said the other thing is sue. So, in the Idaho case, you had somebody who was on the internet who accused a professor of, I think, having an affair with one of the young women who were murdered and being involved somehow, and the professor sued her. And in some ways, I think that's the only way you're going to be able to correct this, because one pops up and others don't. Another thing is the use of AI, which is incredibly disturbing to me. So there are TikToks where you can go and find where you have these content creators who are using AI to take real murder cases, many times of children, and changing the names somewhat, but the circumstances stay the same. And they use AI to recreate these children, and they tell you how they were murdered. And those are particularly disturbing. And, one of the things for me that I'm not sure, it's kind of specialized, I guess, but I have my students listen to some podcasts. And, there's one podcast in particular where it involves a story of a woman who just kind of keeps going back to this man who turns out to be a very bad person over and over again. I found that when I just had my students in the past listen to this podcast, and I would say, what do you think of, the person at the center of this, the woman? And they were, she's an idiot, she's annoying, how could she do that? Like, what was she thinking? It's hard for me to even believe that she would go back multiple times. And about a year and a half ago, I said, I have to reframe this. And so I did this just yesterday with my class. Here are the signs of domestic abuse, control, coercion. Here are the signs of domestic violence. Here's a problem. That podcast doesn't say any of that. And even the host says, no, she's in love with being in love. That's not correct. And so when you have content creators, like it's the Wild West on TikTok and in podcasting, who are creating content and not giving that kind of context, then you're talking about someone who truly is a victim, who is now sort of being accused all over the place of just being a total moron and destructive by bringing somebody into the family like that. So there's a lot of responsibility. And I know we're probably going to end up talking about approaching victims and their families, about addressing stories. How do you even talk to somebody about doing a story about their family?
Yeah, if you could just jump into that, right? And
Sure.
especially, right, that is part of journalistic training, good journalistic ethos and ethics.
Mm-hmm.
But as you mentioned, so many content creators out there maybe never got that training or haven't even been exposed to that kind of consideration, or are making it just to kind of like bring more people to their TikTok. So
Right.
how do we understand and kind of better understand how permission is negotiated with the families of survivors or victims, and thinking about like that side of the ethics even before the stories are spread in this true crime space?
Absolutely. And, I would love to make the assumption that families are approached. 99% of the time they aren't approached. This is stuff that's in the public domain. If there are excerpts of diaries, like if you watch anything on the Gabby Petito case, you see her text messages, you see her journal entries, not just the stuff that she might have posted. She posted very little actually online. She was just getting going. But there's so much information out there that legally they can do what they want to do. They don't have to ask the Petitos or, anybody else for permission whatsoever. So I, of course, gravitate towards the journalists, and you hear the voices in the story. So the story I was just talking about, what it does right with the podcast is it has everybody except the offender, but it has everybody. And so that these people all have a buy-in, and you hear that. Quite frankly, this is why I don't do current cases. I'm uncomfortable with it. I had a family come to me and say, our grandparents were murdered. It happened in like 1935 in a rural area. Can you do the case on your show with Paul Holes, the forensic investigator, and maybe he'll give us some insight? I was just like petrified the whole time, to be honest. I went over it with them over and over again. Is this right? Is this right? Because we're not talking about what I usually deal with, which is like great grandchildren, people who they still want you to get that right, but I'm not knocking on the door like I've had to when I was a network news producer on the family of somebody who was just killed during September 11th and asking permission to tell their story. But even then, I was uncomfortable with something from decades earlier. One thing that has really affected me that I feel like every single true crime content creator must read is a fantastic op-ed piece from Polly Klaas's older sister. And, Polly Klaas is the 12-year-old girl who was kidnapped in 93 from California and later, assaulted and murdered. And her sister wrote decades later, it's in the New York Times, this fantastic piece that basically says, the sister had never wanted to talk about this ever. Now, Mark Klaas was heavily involved with the media and he became an advocate. The sister didn't want that. Her name is Annie. And what she says very eloquently in this op-ed piece is, I had people come to me and give me information about the murder that I explicitly wanted to avoid. And that's what happened. And she said, it has over the years re-traumatized me. And for, 40 years or however long it's been, 30 years, I have been over and over again. Every time there's a story that's on any cable network or anything like that about my sister's murder, it's awful. So there is that line. How do you know that telling a polyclass's story has been very important, but there's a family involved with it? Part of the family has been a huge advocate for, child safety. And then there are people who just don't want to know the details. Why would you tell the sister of a murder victim details from the murder without her asking? I just don't understand where some people come from. And that's my big issue with involving victims' families. You should. And one more point I want to make: the National Center for Victims of Violence would love to see a disclaimer at the top of the monster, Ed Gein, or Monsters, the Menendez brothers, that says the families in this case have not given permission, have chosen not to, at the very beginning, have chosen not to participate in this film, as a disclaimer. I don't know if that's going to happen. And quite frankly, people love unauthorized biographies, and, so it might flock to them even more. But the level of responsibility is pretty great on us, I think.
Yeah, thank you. And we don't have any Q&A questions yet. Any of our participants, please feel free to ask any questions in the Q&A section. But speaking of the monster, the label, I guess I wanted to ask, and this is your chance to maybe put some true crime related media text on notice, or maybe praise ones that have done well. Are there any kind of key books, podcasts, TV shows, movies that you would really highly recommend to any of our kind of listeners, viewers here, or any that's like you said, might pay to have a little bit more of a warning or a context, or really to think about more deeply before engaging with?
Well, my preference would be to praise the good ones rather than call out the bad ones, because after going through that list, I think most people know what are the ones that probably shouldn't be supported, certainly if they're straying away from facts or glorifying serial killers by frankly casting incredibly good-looking actors when it is not accurate depiction of who that person was to begin with. Ironically, I want to say I think one of the best movies out there is Monster, which is the Eileen Wuornos story, and where you have an actress who actually looks like Eileen Wuornos. They created her, and I know that there were Oscars involved in it too, because it was just an amazing performance. It was so raw. It was real. It wasn't in defense of Eileen Wuornos for murdering these men. And it was incredible, especially to me, because there was, I always butcher her last name, Charlize Theron. She is just a striking actress, but they transformed her into Eileen Wuornos, who had a very difficult life, and sort of appeared to have that. So, to have an accurate betrayal like that, to me, just really showed the filmmakers who were caring. I also think Woman of the Hour was an excellent film, about the now I can't remember what his name is, the dating app guy. It wasn't
The dating
Richard
game.
Yeah, no, I can't remember what his name. I bet Katie knows, but I can't remember his name. But those sorts of very real portrayals, I think are really important. Those are just excellent types of stories. And then things that I think that are illuminated that fall under true crime. I found the latest Netflix documentary, which is the Perfect Neighbor, which is about the murder of a woman in Florida by her neighbor and everything that comes into it, and racial overtones and everything else. I found that to be really raw. And it's literally because it is all police body cam footage and, some interrogation footage and a little bit of trial footage. So it's just there, it's out there. And, there is of course can be manipulation, but I think that was Soledad O'Brien who executive produced that, when we're back to a journalist. So there is a responsibility, whatever you think of journalists based on politics or anything else now, we are trained to tackle certain issues, and some do and some don't. I mean, I find problems with many of the podcasts and things that I see headed by journalists, but they are few and far between. And most of the time people are trying to do the right thing.
Yeah. Dick and Katie, any recommendations for shows, movies, books, podcasts that kind of do true crime right?
I mean, the one I like, and I have somewhat mixed feelings, but kind of to Kate's point, I really like when I know a family is involved and they feel like they're getting something from it. And I feel like I've really appreciated the revival of Unsolved Mysteries on Netflix for that reason. Like they very often have very clear family involvement. Like I don't necessarily love like a reenactment. I think that's a little much, but for me, like I really look for things where we have a clear, this person asked for this, or they feel like they're getting something, or that we're helping them learn. And so that's what I look for. And like I said, I feel like this recent revival of Unsolved Mysteries has really been clear about that. And so that's something I really appreciate.
Dick, any suggestions?
Actually, I'll defer to the others for current suggestions, because I feel like I've been addicted lately to crime, series that are streaming on TV, but they're not necessarily true. So true crime. So like, for example, Task. I mean, that's just on HBO. So yeah, no, I don't have anything right now that can suggest.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, we have a couple of questions. Let me take a look. Hold on. Uh, So we've got a question that I think is important, right? So we've talked a lot about different ethical considerations, but if you had, and this question is to all of you, right? If you choose to answer it, if you had one particular element of ethical guidance for people to take away from this with regard to either true crime productions or true crime kind of engagement, what would that be?
I can definitely jump in. This is something I thought a lot about. Like I said, especially seeing how people were so eager to interact on social media, right? It's not just like, oh, I'm interested, but I want to contribute. And I think that it's really important to remember to be able to take a step back and to, maybe look away from these stories and not assume that you really do know best. I think it's so easy to feel like we've learned from narratives to feel like, oh, I am going to be the one who knows more than the cops this time. And I think it's really important to be realistic about that and to be able to say, okay, actually, social media is not giving me the full picture. There are things I don't know, and maybe I don't need to be spending all my time on this.
And, I think I've kind of ticked through what to me are the most important things, and the things that are unknown. I think most people who consume true crime have their own little smell test on stuff, what makes them uncomfortable. And I was listening to a podcast, and it was a very simple thing that really irritated me, where the victim was a prosecutor, and they were much like unsolved cases. They're dangerous because you have to speculate essentially to tell the story, and I don't like to speculate, which is why I don't like true crime stories as far as who the perpetrator is and what were they thinking and all of this other stuff. And so in that show, it was a lot of, there were rumors that she was a lesbian and had been sleeping with men and sleeping with women. And I don't know if it was necessarily what was said, it was more the tone. So I don't know how to explain that, except to say what I try to do, and I tell my students, is if you were related to the person who was murdered and you heard this, and the person reached out to you beforehand and said, listen, I can't tell you what's going to be in this podcast, but I would like to do it, and they've seen your work before, and they said, okay, would you feel proud of this podcast and the way that you represented it? And I know the family of that victim would not have been. And so sometimes it's just a little bit of a, like I said, part of that triggers your smell test that just kind of goes, I don't like this at all. And then don't support it, unsubscribe.
Yeah.
I would just, second what Kate was saying about the litmus test, the smell test or whatever. And I think off-putting or, just the sort of circus atmosphere, the rumor mongering the sensationalism that can just escalate everything. So it gets this out of control sense, and where it can be more about attention seeking and the folks who are on social media. But as far as the uptick in true crime in all these formats and the following that it's generated, in the way that Kate does it in its best ways, we have now learned, I think, for the past several decades, largely through DNA technology, that investigations, that the court system, the justice is imperfect. And at its best, I think true crime coverage in the genre helps kind of serve as a vehicle for accountability and oversight, and airing out some of that. So, and again, so I like to see it sometimes in its best case scenario that way.
Yeah. And that leads us into my final question for all three of y'all. And it kind of touches on some of the Q&A points, right? Kind of looking at our cultural, and I think we need to consider the media industry side as well, moment we're in. Like the why now question. Why this cycle seemingly kind of everywhere now, and so much emphasis on streaming platforms, on social media, on podcasts, and all these different places, this kind of renewed attention and emphasis on true crime stories. Does it indicate something about our current relationship to violence and justice? And I should note in the Q&A, somebody pointed out that the preponderance of production and consumption is in Anglophone countries, and especially ones with a lot of white constituents to the genre. And, there is a long history of not just women flocking to true crime, but particularly white women, and even cable channels like Oxygen and OWN kind of rebranding toward more white female viewership by flocking kind of true crime stories to their programming schedule.
Katie, do you want to take it?
Sure. Sure. I mean, I think there are a couple of things. I mean, I guess this brings it full circle to where we started even, right? That it's not just a genre or just a subject. It's very pervasive and pervasive across all these. And I do think one thing for a lot of people, the world's a scary place. There's a lot of uncertainty. And I think true crime really highlights just how drastically things can change so quickly. And I do think that goes back to what we said, it's part of why women do gravitate towards it, because it does feel like we're often focusing on women as the victims. But I think overall, there's this sense of, I didn't know that the world could be like this, or I know the world could be like this, and now I have proof. And I can find evidence of that, whether it's in a book, on a TV channel, on streaming, on social media. And so not only do I know this and I'm interested in it, but I don't have to escape it. And I do think you're right. Media industry plays a huge role. Clearly, we've said we're going to pay attention to this. We're going to click on it. We're going to buy it. And so they're going to continue making sure that we have plenty to access. I mean, just back to the Idaho murders, right? There have been 2 different documentaries that have come out about that just in the last couple months. And I'm sure we're not near the end of the amount of coverage that will get.
Yeah, I would say that's certainly true. And to me, it's a little bit of a chicken or the egg. In my class with my students, I have 250. It's a huge class for me. And I say, who's a true crime fan at the beginning of this? And it's 60, 70%. And the first thing I said is, this is not underwater basket weaving for those of you who are taking this because it fits neatly in your schedule. we talk about really, really difficult things. And inexplicably, my numbers go up the next week. I have no idea how that happens. I try to scare them off if this is not right for them. By the end, though, we end up having quite a few people who are interested in true crime. And I have a lot of people who say, I never considered this genre. I've never listened to anything in true crime, but I like the way that the stories are told. And some of the podcasts that I gear them towards are very ethical. And so they appreciate the way the story is told in that way. They're not getting too graphic, about, the things that happen in the stories. That's another big key for me. And so, I think it is a little bit more of like, are we creating more true crime fans, or did everybody exist already? And now they've have all of these elements here that they can go and tap into more and more and more now. My show just went on YouTube. So now we're even more prolific. So that's just the name of the game with this.
We have to end there. And I think, maybe it taps into what Dick said earlier about true crime speaking to these larger social topical issues as well. So thank you very much to our guests. Thank you to everybody who attended. Have a good rest of your Friday.